you? What is happening?
They found me.
That's impossible. You disappeared months ago.
That's what they wanted everyone to believe.
I'm not dead.
I was betrayed. Once this signal leaves, everything changes.
How many people will see it?
Everyone who still remembers the truth. Hand him over and this ends peacefully.
No one is taking him.
Now they know I'm alive.
You wanted proof. Here it is.
This changes nothing. You spent months trying to erase me. Now I'm here. Let's see who owns the truth.
Simone Ellison gave the homeless man a guest room, a hot meal, and exactly one night under her roof. He didn't ask for money, didn't explain his past, and never mentioned why a man with cracked, calloused hands still wore the ghost of a mark where a ring had once sat, one that had clearly cost more than most people's homes. Before he went to sleep, he asked only one question: whether her estate's security system was connected to a private satellite network. By dawn, the windows began to shake in their frames. 10 helicopters circled the mansion above Mercer Island, and the stranger stood at the glass and said quietly, almost to himself, "They found me. Stay until the end. Because this man is carrying a secret powerful enough to shake the entire world of billionaires to its foundation." The rain over Seattle that Tuesday evening was the kind that didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, thick and cold and indifferent, coating the highway in a gray sheen that made every headlight blur into a smear. Simone Ellison sat in the back seat of her SUV and said nothing for the first several minutes after the board meeting ended, which was unusual for a woman whose operations director described her as someone who processed problems out loud. The meeting had gone badly, which was itself a kind of understatement. Preston Ashbourne had placed an offer document on the table with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the conversation was already over, his voice smooth and measured as he explained to the assembled board that Ellison Meridian Systems no longer had the financial leverage to resist a full acquisition offer from Rowan Sovereign Industries. He had laid out the debt figures, the competitive pressure, and the timeline with the precision of a surgeon, and several board members had nodded along as if the conclusion were obvious, as if Simone's decade of work had simply run its natural course. She had listened to every word, thanked the board for their time, and walked out without agreeing to a single thing, because she understood, in a way Preston apparently did not, that her routing algorithm didn't just optimize logistics corridors. It could track every anomalous shipment pattern in a global supply chain, and in the wrong hands, that capability would stop being a transparency tool and become something far more useful for people with things to hide. Her driver slowed near a shuttered gas station on the eastern edge of the city, not because of traffic, but because something had stopped ahead. A compact car pulled crookedly to the shoulder, its hazard lights throwing amber pulses across the wet asphalt. Simone leaned forward slightly and saw, through the rain, a man crouching beside the rear wheel well of the disabled vehicle, working with bare hands in the cold, reattaching what appeared to be a loose battery cable, while a woman behind the wheel kept the engine turning over uselessly. He had no umbrella, no jacket thick enough for the temperature, and no particular urgency in his movements. Just a kind of deliberate, unhurried competence that looked strange in a man whose coat was clearly worn thin at the elbows. The woman finally got her engine started, gave a brief tap of the horn that may or may not have been intended as a thank you, and pulled away without rolling down her window or stopping, leaving the man alone on the shoulder in the rain, with nothing to show for the effort. Simone watched him straighten, wipe his hands on the front of his jacket, and begin walking east with the particular gait of someone who has been walking for a long time and has made a kind of peace with the fact. Her driver asked if they should continue, and for a moment Simone almost said yes. She was tired. She had a 7 o'clock call with London in the morning, and she had been told, more than once, that the instinct to stop for strangers was not the habit of a woman running a company of several hundred employees. But she had also slept in the back seat of a car for 11 consecutive nights when she was 9 years old, parked in the lot behind a grocery store in Tacoma, while her mother figured out what came next, and she had never once forgotten this specific quality of cold that settles in when no one stops. She asked her driver to pull ahead slowly and roll down the window, and when the man turned, she offered him a ride to the nearest shelter. A reasonable offer, a contained gesture, nothing that required much of her. He declined the first time, calmly and without offense, saying simply that he didn't want to inconvenience her, which was not something most people said, and not in that particular tone. When her driver called ahead, both shelters within a reasonable distance confirmed they were at capacity. Simone looked at the man once more through the window, his quiet refusal to perform desperation, the way he held eye contact without aggression or appeal, and made the kind of decision she would later be asked about in many different rooms, by many different people, each with their own theory about what it meant. She offered him the guest room at her estate on Mercer Island for one night, made clear it was one night, and told him a car would take him wherever he needed to go at 8 in the morning. He accepted after a brief pause, folded himself into the seat with careful, almost deliberate stillness, and said nothing until they were on the bridge, at which point he glanced at the display screen on the center console, where the Ellison Meridian Systems logo rotated slowly in its idle animation, and then looked out the window at the dark water below with an expression Simone couldn't quite read. He said nothing about the logo. She noticed he noticed it. What she did not notice, until the lights of the estate appeared through the tree line and the car slowed at the gate, was that he had spent a portion of the drive watching the satellite routing map on the secondary screen, the one that displayed her company's live network overlay as a default screensaver, and that somewhere in those few minutes he had quietly identified a misalignment in one of the northern corridor nodes that her entire technical team had not caught in the previous quarterly audit. He mentioned it once, briefly, as they pulled in, the way a person mentions that your headlight has been left on. Not drawing attention to his knowledge, just noting a fact that seemed useful to share. Tessa Donovan called before Simone had reached the front door, which meant someone on the security detail had already flagged the situation upward, because Tessa had a gift for knowing things she had not yet officially been told. Her voice on the line was measured and professional in the specific way it got when she was working to keep alarm out of her register, and she asked, without quite asking, whether Simone had perhaps made a decision this evening that she might want to discuss with her operations director before the morning. Simone confirmed that she had a guest for the night, that the perimeter security was active on all zones, and that the guest would be gone before the 9 o'clock briefing. And then she hung up because Tessa was loyal and smart, and also perfectly capable of worrying on her own time. The man accepted the clothes she offered, a plain gray sweatshirt and trousers, left behind by a contractor who had never come back for them, with a thank you that was neither excessive nor absent, the kind of gratitude that doesn't perform itself. At dinner, which Simone had assembled from what was in the kitchen rather than anything elaborate, he ate slowly, with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely hungry but had not lost the habit of table manners. He didn't touch the wine she set out, knew exactly which fork to use for which course, and folded his napkin precisely when he was finished in a way that suggested the gesture was automatic, rather than deliberate. Neither of them spoke much during the first half of the meal, which Simone found, against her expectation, not uncomfortable. She had become accustomed, in the decade since the company had grown to a point where she was never simply herself in any room, to dinners that required her to perform some version of herself at all times, and the silence was a relief she hadn't known she needed. It was the photograph on the wall that broke the quiet. A framed print Simone had bought years earlier at a charity auction, a black and white image of a sleek experimental aircraft silhouetted against a white test sky, taken at a Rowan Sovereign Industries aviation showcase. She had always kept it there because she admired the design, not for any particular connection to the company. The man looked at it for a long moment in silence and then said, quietly and without inflection, that the engine designation on the placard in the corner of the photo was wrong. that the exhibit label had used the name of the production model, not the prototype, and they were substantially different configurations. He did not explain how he knew. When Simone asked whether he had worked in aviation, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he had built some things and watched other people put their names on them, which was the kind of answer that could mean many things, and was clearly designed to. She noted it and said nothing further. He found the intrusion while she was in the kitchen. A signal probing the estate's external network boundary, systematically testing access points with a pattern that was not random but sequential, which meant it was either a vulnerability scanner run by someone who knew what they were doing or someone who knew the system architecture specifically. He used the guest access panel in the hallway, a secondary terminal meant for visitors to control room temperature and lighting, to isolate the external network segment before the probe could establish a session, moving through the interface with the fluency of someone who had designed systems like this rather than merely used them. When Simone returned and he told her what he had done, she looked at him for a moment with an expression caught between skepticism and the kind of dread that comes from recognizing something you'd rather not recognize. The security center confirmed it within 4 minutes. An unauthorized access attempt, traced back through 2 relay points to a server registered to a logistics contractor with a known services agreement with Rowan Sovereign Industries. He was watching her face when she got the confirmation. He told her to power down every device with a satellite uplink before midnight, and he told her to do it quietly, without routing the shutdown command through the main system network. Because if whoever was scanning the estate saw the network go dark all at once, they would know the probe had been detected, and they would move faster. Simone did not immediately comply. She stood in the center of the living room, with her arms crossed, and told him plainly that she was not going to start disconnecting systems in her own home on the instruction of a man whose last name she did not know, and that if he wanted her cooperation, she needed something more than the word of someone she had found in the rain. He was quiet for a moment, not offended, not rattled, and then told her his first name was Elias, that he had once run a company, and that the people he had trusted most had taken it from him, using paperwork he never signed, and a diagnosis he never received. He offered nothing more. She told him that story could describe any number of disgruntled former employees, and she said it not cruelly but directly, the way she handled most things, and he nodded as if conceding the point was fair. Tessa, working from her home office with access to the estate's camera feeds, had already pulled a still frame from the front door sensor and run it through 3 identification databases before Simone finished the conversation. The results came back inconclusive. The face was too gaunt, too obscured by several weeks of growth, too changed from any reference image to produce a clean match. But one legacy system, an older algorithm that ran on probability coefficients rather than geometric mapping, flagged a partial similarity score that stopped Tessa mid-breath. The system had matched the bone structure, the ear shape, and the approximate proportions to a name that had been in the financial news cycle for most of the past year. Elias Rowan, founder of Rowan Sovereign Industries, who had officially withdrawn from all business activities 8 months ago, citing a psychiatric health decline, and who was presumed by most insiders to have died in a boating incident off the coast of British Columbia 4 months after that. Tessa sat very still for a moment before she called Simone. Simone looked at the man, sitting across the room in a borrowed sweatshirt, drinking water from a glass, completely still, and tried to hold the 2 images in her mind at the same time, the man in front of her and the face she had seen in the financial press. Always in a tailored suit and always slightly distant from the camera, the kind of man who moved through rooms as if the rooms had been arranged for him. She could see it, in the way you can see a sculpture in a rough block of stone if you look from the right angle. She told him what Tessa had found. He didn't flinch. He confirmed his name, quietly and without drama, and then said the words she had been half expecting. He told her that Tessa's search, if it had gone through any company server, had already broadcast a confirmation ping to a monitoring network that was watching for exactly that query. He said they had perhaps 3 hours, maybe less. before people began arriving at her address from multiple directions, and that some of them would come to help him, and some of them would come to prevent that. Tessa called back a minute later to confirm she had used the main company server. On the security overlay, Simone watched 3 clusters of movement converging on Mercer Island from separate vectors. One from the north along the highway corridor, one from the water on the western side, and one she could not yet identify approaching from the city's eastern interchange. He told her the full account the way a person delivers a briefing, without emotional performance, in sequence, with the economy of someone who has rehearsed the telling not for sympathy but for efficiency. 8 months ago, Elias had been in the middle of a board-level review when his compliance team surfaced an irregularity in a Rowan Sovereign subsidiary account. Funds and data moving through a shell arrangement to a foreign logistics platform without authorization, structured to avoid the disclosure thresholds that would trigger board oversight. He had traced it to Conrad Blackwood, a man whose name appeared on the original incorporation papers, whose handshake had for years been worth more than most people's signatures. And when Elias began assembling documentation for the audit committee, a medical evaluation he had never agreed to produce to file, declaring him unfit for executive judgment, a power of attorney, generated electronically with a signature he did not recognize as his own, transferred his board voting authority to a standing committee. Every institutional asset he held, accounts, aircraft, residences, communications, existed inside the Rowan Sovereign infrastructure he had built, and using any of it would have activated the location architecture of a surveillance system he had designed himself. He walked away from everything in a single night, withdrew cash from an ATM that predated his own company's network integration, and began moving through a city that did not know him, without any of the markers that had defined him for 15 years. The beard grew, the weight dropped, and the facial recognition cameras at shelters and transit hubs, many running on infrastructure Rowan Sovereign had licensed to municipal contracts, identified him as no one of note. His objective was an offline data vault he had maintained privately, holding duplicate transaction ledgers and original signatures that would establish exactly what Conrad had done. He had been 2 days from reaching it when Conrad's team picked up his trail, and he altered course twice in 48 hours, and the second alteration had taken him down a rain-soaked road near a shuttered gas station on a Tuesday evening. Simone asked why the FBI had not been his first call, and he said Conrad had cultivated relationships inside federal regulatory and law enforcement contacts across 3 administrations, and he could not tell which lines were clean. The one person he trusted completely was Victoria Langford, the company's first outside investor, the one person who had never moved against him in 20 years, but every known channel to her was monitored. He told Simone that her bringing him to this house had already made both of them part of the picture Conrad was looking at, and he offered to walk out into the night immediately. She told him to sit down. A security probe had already accessed her network from a Rowan Sovereign contractor address. She was in the picture whether she chose to be or not. She asked what he needed most urgently, and he told her, a signal to Victoria that was authenticated and untraceable through any infrastructure Conrad's team could monitor. Simone told him her company's satellite routing protocol fragmented and relayed signals through non-sequential nodes in a way that made source tracing computationally impractical. She had built it to protect supply chain data. It would work just as well for this. They worked at the secondary terminal in the library, Elias directing and Simone operating, because it was her system and her credentials. Splitting the authentication signal into 11 partial packets routed through relay nodes in 4 separate network jurisdictions, none of which would resolve to a single origin address when reassembled at the receiving end. The content of the signal was not a message in any conventional sense. It was a coordinate, string and altitude reading, and a 6-word phrase, and Elias said it quietly as Simone typed. The exact coordinates of the airfield where the first Rowan Sovereign test flight had departed 17 years earlier, paired with the sentence he and Victoria had said to each other when they shook hands over the original funding agreement. He said it would tell her everything she needed to know, and that she would act on it within minutes of receiving it. Victoria Langford was in her study in Portland when the signal arrived, and she recognized what it meant before she had finished reading it, because she had spent the past 4 months being told, by people whose information she had learned not to fully trust, that Elias Rowan was either institutionalized or dead, and because the coordinates and the phrase were things only 2 people in the world knew. She made 4 calls in the space of 8 minutes, to her chief of security, to the senior partner of the law firm she retained for corporate emergencies, to the independent physician she used for executive evaluations, and to the pilot of the helicopter that sat in a hangar on the south side of Portland International Airport. She told each of them that she needed to be at an address on Mercer Island before 4 in the morning, and that they needed to bring everything they would need for a situation that might become, very quickly, a legal confrontation. What Victoria could not have known was that Conrad Blackwood's network had also detected the signal. Not the full content, which the fragmented routing had protected, but the pattern of the relay activity itself, which his technical team had flagged as anomalous. He made his own calls, directing a helicopter and a legal team, carrying the guardianship documents and the medical file, and the order he gave was simple: reach the address before Victoria did, and present the papers before anyone could photograph Elias voluntarily participating in anything. The aviation monitoring system over Puget Sound logged the first unusual flight cluster before 3 in the morning, and by 3:32 news crews had dispatched their own aircraft. Simone was standing on the balcony with her coffee when the sound arrived. A low, rhythmic percussion building over the water from the southwest, growing until she could pick out individual rotors from the mass of sound. And then she was counting 1, 2, 3, appearing over the tree line from the south, 2 more from the direction of the city, others appearing at intervals from different compass points until the sky above the lake held 10 aircraft in a loose circling arrangement, their lights turning the low clouds above Mercer Island into a moving ceiling of amber and white. The security panel inside was receiving simultaneous landing authorization requests from parties she didn't recognize. Elias appeared beside her at the railing, studied the aircraft for a moment, and identified a single helicopter bearing a marking she couldn't make out at this distance. He told her that one had not been sent by anyone trying to help him. The external speaker on that helicopter crackled to life a minute later, delivering a request that was phrased as a courtesy and was clearly an instruction. Would the resident of the property please facilitate the handover of the individual, known as Elias Rowan, to the authorized medical guardian currently present at the main gate. Victoria landed at a private golf course, a quarter-mile from the estate perimeter, and the sound of her helicopter had not yet fully faded when 2 men in suits appeared at the main gate carrying a legal document packet and identifying themselves as representatives of the guardian arrangement established by the Rowan Sovereign Board under its emergency management provision. Eleanor Pierce, who had arrived 12 minutes behind Victoria by car, asked to review the documents before anyone entered, and the gate stayed closed, while she read through 4 pages of filing with the focused speed of someone who had been doing exactly this kind of work for 2 decades. Conrad Blackwood appeared on Simpson's tablet via video call without being invited, which told her he had someone inside the estate's communications system with the ability to initiate outbound contact, a detail she logged and did not react to outwardly. He spoke to her the way people speak when they believe they are being generous. He explained that she had unwittingly become involved in a medical situation that predated her, that no one blamed her for the confusion, and that the simplest resolution was for her to allow his team to take custody of a man who was not well and who could not make sound decisions for himself. He said, at the end, that if she cooperated, every outstanding obligation that Ellison Meridian Systems held with institutions connected to the Rowan Sovereign Network would be forgiven within 30 days. Simone recognized the architecture of the offer immediately. It was the same lever Preston had been using for 6 months, the same implicit argument that her company's financial vulnerability made her choices for her. She told Conrad that she had not brought a man home to sell him back in the morning, that she was not qualified to assess anyone's medical status, and that no one would be entering or leaving her property until her legal counsel had reviewed every document on both sides of the gate. She said this calmly, in front of her security team, Tessa on speakerphone, and Eleanor standing 3 feet away, and she watched Conrad's expression on the tablet screen shift from measured to something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. Victoria and Elias stood in the guest room for a long moment after she was brought in. Two people who had spent 8 months believing different things about whether the other would still be there at the end of it. And then Victoria composed herself and told him, evenly, that she needed him to submit to a cognitive assessment by the independent physician she had brought, because the legal challenge to his guardianship order required a clean, documented evaluation that no one could argue was arranged by a party with a stake in the outcome. Elias said yes immediately, which surprised her, and he said it was because he had spent 8 months insisting he was mentally competent to everyone who hadn't been listening, and he was not going to ask anyone to take that on faith when evidence was available. The physician spent 40 minutes asking structured questions, and Elias answered each with clear precision: dates, figures, sequences of events, decisions, and their documented rationale, until, toward the end of the session, he stopped and pointed to a date on the fabricated medical record that Eleanor had brought in from the gate. The date was a Wednesday in the previous October. Elias said quietly that on that Wednesday he had been on a stage at a technology conference in Chicago delivering the opening keynote, that the session had been live streamed to an archived recording, and that the timestamp on the recording would show him speaking for 90 minutes beginning at 10 in the morning on the exact date that the record claimed a psychiatrist had been documenting his incapacity in a Seattle clinical setting. The physician looked at the document for a long moment, and then looked at Eleanor and said nothing more was needed. Tessa's voice came through the phone 30 seconds later. Preston Ashbourne had called an emergency board meeting at Ellison Meridian headquarters for 7 in the morning. The vote was already scheduled. If Simone was not in the room to stop it, the company would be sold to a Blackwood-controlled entity before the business day was an hour old. Elias told her to go. He said it clearly, without ceremony, standing near the window where the helicopter lights were still tracing slow arcs above the water. He said her kindness the previous night had given him the first solid ground he had stood on in 8 months, and that he would not be the reason she lost what she had spent a decade building. Simone looked at him for a moment and then said something that cut through the sentiment entirely. She told him that her company was being targeted specifically because her routing technology could identify and flag the kind of supply chain irregularities that Conrad had been running for years, and that the attack on Ellison Meridian and the attack on Elias Rowan were not 2 separate situations, but 2 fronts of the same campaign, which meant she could not protect one without addressing the other, and there was no version of this morning in which staying at the estate or going to the boardroom were actually different decisions. Victoria organized a brief statement on the estate's east lawn. 3 minutes, no prepared text, just confirmation of identity and willingness. And Elias walked out into the morning light in the gray sweatshirt and plain trousers he had borrowed from a stranger's guest room, without a tie or a title or anything that announced him as anything other than a man who had decided to be present. The images reached financial news desks within 4 minutes of the first camera capturing his face, and trading in Rowan Sovereign shares was halted within 12. Conrad filed an emergency broadcast injunction through a circuit court contact. But Eleanor presented documentation showing the injunction had not yet been docketed, which meant it had no legal standing to compel any party to stop anything. Elias did not accuse Conrad of anything in front of the cameras. He stated, in 2 sentences, that he was in full possession of his faculties and had been for the entirety of the past 8 months, and that every business decision made under the authority of the guardianship arrangement and power of attorney documents would require independent forensic audit before they could be considered binding. He thanked the assembled press, nodded once in Simone's direction, and turned back toward the building. Preston convened the vote anyway, having apparently received legal counsel, suggesting that the halt in Rowan sovereign trading and the existence of a live Elias Rowan did not automatically invalidate the purchase process for Ellison Meridian, which was a separate corporate entity with its own standing board. Simone, Elias, Victoria, and Eleanor boarded one of Victoria's helicopters while the estate security team, Conrad's grounded crew, and 2 news aircraft sorted themselves into the disorganized aftermath of a morning that none of them had scripted. In the air, with the lake falling away below them and the city rising on the horizon, Tessa's voice came through the headset with the particular flatness she used when the news was worse than expected. A board member at Ellison Meridian, a man named Curtis Webb, who had been appointed to the seat 18 months earlier through a recommendation from Preston, had uploaded the complete routing source code to an off-site server address that mapped back to a Blackwood-controlled subsidiary. It had happened 40 minutes ago. The code was already somewhere it shouldn't be. The boardroom was in the middle of the second procedural motion when Simone walked in, which Preston handled with the composure of a man who had been expecting her and had decided not to be deterred. He addressed the assembled board with the careful language of someone who had prepared for this moment. He said that recent events, the incident at the CEO's residence, the media spectacle at the waterfront property, the involvement of outside parties in what appeared to be a coordinated effort to disrupt a legitimate acquisition process, had given the board ample grounds to question whether the current leadership was capable of stable, rational decision-making, and that the acquisition offer from the Blackwood-affiliated entity remained on the table and should be evaluated on its financial merits rather than on the personal circumstances of the evening prior. Simone did not respond to any of that. She set a data drive on the table, opened the room's presentation system, and walked the board through 47 minutes of server logs, access records, and file transfer receipts, documenting the systematic extraction of Ellison Meridian proprietary data over the preceding 6 months, routed in each instance to infrastructure connected to Rowan sovereign subsidiaries operating under Conrad Blackwood's authority. She did not editorialize. She let the dates and file names and destination addresses make the argument on their own. Elias entered the room while she was still presenting, and the shift in the room was immediate and unmistakable. These were people who had spent months hearing Conrad's version of Elias Rowan's condition, and the man standing in the doorway bore no resemblance to the narrative they had been given. He addressed the board directly, without notes, explaining the specific capability that had made Simone's algorithm a target. The routing system was not merely a logistics tool, but an audit mechanism, and when paired with the transaction ledgers he had maintained in an offline facility, it would generate an automated record of every falsified shipment route, every misdirected cargo manifest, and every financial transfer that Conrad had moved through Rowan Sovereign's supply chain infrastructure for the better part of 3 years. The room was quiet when he finished. Preston said Elias had no verified legal standing in this room, that his voting rights remained suspended pending a formal board resolution, and that his presence here in cooperation with Simone strongly suggested that the two of them were working together to protect their respective interests, rather than serving any fiduciary obligation to the shareholders they claimed to represent. Tessa pulled up the server logs that showed Preston's authenticated credentials initiating the source code transfer and a payment confirmation from a shell entity registered in Delaware. The same entity that had, 6 weeks earlier, wired a sum into an investment account held in Preston's wife's name. Several board members looked at Preston and then looked at the wall behind him rather than at him, which was its own kind of verdict. Then Conrad moved, and the move was clean and fast. A call to the primary lending institution triggered a force clause in the debt covenant, presenting Ellison Meridian with a demand for early repayment of the outstanding facility within 72 hours, a sum that the company could not produce without either a sale or an emergency capital injection. Victoria made the offer within 60 seconds of hearing the number. A bridge facility, full-term, immediate deployment, but the offer came with a board approval requirement, which meant the vote that Preston had intended to use for a sale would now be used for something else instead. Simone looked at the term sheet. Victoria's counsel slid across the table and saw what she needed to see. No equity stake, no board seat, no voting rights, repayment structured against revenue rather than a fixed maturity. She made one amendment, a revenue cap on the repayment acceleration clause that would protect the company's operating margin in a down quarter, and Victoria's counsel accepted it in writing in the room. The vote to sell failed by a margin of 6-2. The bridge loan was approved 7-1, with Preston declining to vote, and then being asked to leave the room pending the completion of a preliminary investigation into the server transfer logs. Elias said, before the board had fully reassembled itself, that he intended to use the ownership stake he still retained in Rowan Sovereign, approximately 19%, held through a personal trust that the fabricated power of attorney had not been able to reach, because the trust's governing documents required a physical notarial confirmation that no one had managed to obtain, to compel a full forensic audit of every decision made under the guardianship arrangement. He was mid-sentence when a message came through to Eleanor's device. Conrad had left the building through a service exit 20 minutes earlier, carrying a small case, and had not been seen since. Conrad Blackwood arrived at the private terminal with the case under one arm, and a departure manifest for a flight that would leave American airspace within 3 hours, and he sat down in the lounge with the specific composure of a man who has just finished a difficult chapter and believes the next one will be better. The drive in the case held what he believed to be the only surviving copy of the transaction ledger that could confirm the scope and structure of everything he had authorized over the past several years. The document that Elias had threatened to produce and that Conrad had spent 8 months trying to locate and eliminate. He had recovered it, he believed, from the estate property during the confusion of the morning, slipped from a secondary storage terminal by the member of his team who had been embedded in the security access request during the overnight hours. He allowed himself, in that terminal lounge, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had managed the board, managed the press, managed the legal exposure, and was now about to manage his exit. He connected the drive to his laptop to verify the file index before departure, which was the last decision in a long series of decisions that had each seemed individually reasonable. Elias had prepared the decoy drive 14 weeks before this morning. The files on it were genuine transaction records, a partial subset carefully selected to be real enough to satisfy a verification scan, but the drive also contained a passive logging module embedded in the file system metadata that activated on first connection to any network device and recorded the machine address, network topology, and any connected infrastructure visible to the host system. When Conrad's laptop opened the drive in the terminal, Lounge the Maj ran silently in the background for 11 minutes, mapping every server, account reference, and connected entity in Conrad's current working environment before the logging packet was transmitted through the airport's public network to a receiving address that Eleanor Pierce had pre-registered with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit that morning. The packet arrived before Conrad had finished reviewing the file index. The aircraft was placed on a ground hold before the boarding announcement. Conrad was not confronted at the gate by anyone carrying a weapon or wearing a uniform. He was simply informed by the terminal manager that the aircraft would not be departing as scheduled, and that several parties had requested his presence at a regulatory proceeding that had been opened within the past hour. Preston Ashbourne was removed from the Ellison Meridian Board by a formal resolution passed that afternoon, and a commercial fraud referral was submitted to federal prosecutors citing the theft of proprietary source code and the receipt of undisclosed consideration from a competing party while serving in a fiduciary capacity. The medical file constructed to describe Elias Rowan's condition was formally invalidated by the physician who had conducted the morning's assessment, who submitted a professional declaration attesting that the document's clinical claims were inconsistent with his findings and that at least one date in the record was factually impossible. The Rowan Sovereign Board convened in emergency session and voted to restore Elias's proxy rights, pending the outcome of a full independent audit, with the specific provision that he would not exercise executive authority unilaterally during the review period, a condition he had requested himself. He told the board, in a statement that was brief and not theatrical, that the situation that had allowed 8 months of unauthorized control to take place had not developed overnight, that he had spent years concentrating authority in a small group of people who had eventually decided to use that concentration against him, and that the audit should examine not only what Conrad had done, but what structural decisions he had made that had enabled it. Simone, walking back through her own building that afternoon, said to no one in particular that Elias Rowans was not as straightforwardly innocent as the morning's events had made him appear, and Tessa, who was walking beside her, said that was probably the most honest thing that had been said in this building all week. 6 months passed, and Mercer Island in November looked nothing like it had in the rain of that Tuesday evening. The lake ran gray-silver in the mornings, and the trees had dropped their color. But Ellison Meridian Systems was still there, still independent, still operating under the same name and the same founder. The services agreement with the restructured Rowan Sovereign entity was 3 months old, negotiated by lawyers representing both companies in a room that also contained 2 independent compliance monitors, and it specified exactly what Simone's routing technology would and would not do inside the larger network. Supply chain verification and anomaly flagging, licensed under a defined scope, with all underlying code remaining the sole intellectual property of Ellison Meridian and subject to annual third-party audit. Not a transfer, not a merger. A contract, the way Simone had always preferred to operate. Elias had returned to Rowan Sovereign in an interim capacity, occupying the chairman's seat, but distributing daily authority to a leadership team assembled largely by the Independent Audit Committee, with governance documents that required multi-party confirmation for any decision above a defined threshold, and a standing board seat allocated to an independent director selected by a process that no executive of the company could influence or veto. He had spent considerable time in the months since the morning at the estate explaining to journalists, regulators, and several congressional staff members how a company could be taken from its founder in 9 days using nothing more than forged documents and a concentrated authority structure, and what changes in corporate governance would make that kind of seizure harder. Not impossible, because he had stopped believing in impossible, but substantially harder, which was the realistic ambition. Victoria chaired the Ethics Committee. It met monthly, published its findings on the company's public reporting portal, and had already referred 2 matters for further investigation that had nothing to do with Conrad. Tessa received the formal Chief Operating Officer appointment in the 4th month, effective retroactively to the date of the board meeting at which she had presented the server logs, because Simone believed in paying people for what they had already done, rather than for what they were about to be asked to do. The transitional housing program that Simone seeded from a portion of the company's 4th quarter surplus was not named after her, not branded with the company logo, and was not mentioned in any of her public appearances. It operated through an independent foundation with a board composed primarily of people who had used the services themselves, offering short-term housing placement alongside skills, matching for individuals with professional or technical backgrounds who had lost their footing for reasons that were usually not as simple as the word homeless suggested. Elias had, in the weeks after the estate, located the people who had given him shelter, food, or passage during the 8 months he had spent without a name. Through shelters, church kitchens, overnight waiting rooms, and one mechanic's garage where he had slept 2 nights under a tarp. He asked Eleanor to structure individual agreements with each of them, at amounts he specified but not disclosed publicly, with confidentiality that ran both directions. They would not be asked to speak about him, and he would not tell their stories without permission. Several declined money and asked instead for references or training access. He said yes to everything. Between Simone and Elias, there was a quality of regard that neither of them had a tidy word for, Not friendship exactly, not the beginning of something more, but the specific recognition that develops between two people who have seen each other stripped of performance and left only as themselves. He called her one evening in October to ask if she would have dinner at a restaurant the reviews described as the kind of place where important dinners happen, and she declined, and offered instead to make the same soup from the first night, and said he was welcome to the island if he wanted a meal without a seating chart. He came on a Thursday. They ate at the same table where he had correctly identified a routing error and incorrectly identified the engine on the aircraft photograph, and neither of them talked about the company or the morning with the helicopters, which was an enormous relief to both. He stood for a moment in front of the guest room after dinner, the door slightly open, the room unchanged, the same spare lamp and the same plain chair, and Simone, who was standing in the hallway behind him, asked what he remembered most about that night. He said, for the first time in years, someone had opened a door without first asking what he owned. She told him she had learned something too, that the value of opening that door had nothing to do with who he turned out to be afterward, and that if the morning had come and he had still been nobody, which is to say a person with no empire to reclaim and no helicopters to summon, the door would still have been the right thing. A single small helicopter crossed the lake outside the window, a private medical transit, nothing to do with either of them, and they both looked up at the same moment, and then at each other, and the laughter came quietly at first, and then less quietly, and it was the specific kind that only arrives when something that was once frightening has finished being so. Before he left, Elias gave her a key. She turned it over in her hand and said nothing, waiting for the explanation. Because she had learned over the previous months that he rarely gave anything without one. He told her it opened a warehouse on the south side of the city, a space that Rowan Sovereign had agreed to fund as a technical training facility. Staffed by credentialed instructors in software engineering, aviation systems, and logistics management, and designed to accept applications from anyone who had professional or technical experience, and was currently without stable housing. He said the design team had proposed naming it after him or after the foundation, and he had told them to name it after no one in particular, to let the name belong to the people who worked there. Simone said she would contribute operating funds for the first 3 years, on one condition, that the program's public materials never described it as charity, only as a second entry point into work that had always been available to people who already knew how to do it. She drove the long way home that night, along the road that ran parallel to the highway where she had first seen him. Past the shuttered gas station, the wet shoulder, the spot where a woman had driven away without a thank you and a man had kept walking in the rain. She noticed, almost without planning to, a figure sitting beneath the narrow overhang of a bus shelter. A man, 50s, a duffel bag at his feet, watching the road the way people watch roads when they are not sure where the road goes. Simone stopped the car. She got out, walked to the shelter, and handed him a small card with an address printed on it, the address of the new center, and she asked if he needed a ride somewhere because the rain was starting again, and the next bus was not for 40 minutes, and there was no good reason to sit in the wet when a car was right there. The night Simone opened the door of her estate to a man she did not know, she had no information about how many aircraft he had once owned, how many companies carried his name, or how many billions had moved through accounts he controlled. She did not know his last name. She knew it was cold, that he had helped a stranger with no expectation of return, and that every shelter within reach was full. That was the entirety of her calculation. 10 helicopters arrived at dawn to tell the world who Elias Rowan was, the restored founder, the man the financial press called the most consequential corporate story of the year. But the door that Simone opened in the rain was not for a founder or a billionaire or a man with a story worth telling. It was for a person who was cold and tired and needed one night of somewhere safe to sleep. And that, in the end, is what he said he remembered most,